People think the scariest part of taking public transport late at night is being alone. But the real fear starts when routine takes over and you stop questioning what's happening around you, which is exactly how I ended up on the last train after midnight because I'd taken the same route home for years and never once imagined that one night the schedule might quietly change without telling anyone. And when I reached the platform at 12:08 a.m. to see the board already reading, "Last train, departed," I stood there longer than I should have, not ready to accept that I'd missed it, when the lights at the far end of the station dimmed just slightly, and I felt a vibration through the floor, not the roar of an engine, but a calm, steady movement approaching. And then a full passenger train pulled into the station without announcement, without appearing on the board, stopping perfectly as if it had always been meant to arrive. And no one questioned it, because exhaustion makes strange things feel normal. And when the doors opened, I stepped inside along with a handful of other late-night commuters. Noticing immediately how quiet everything felt, how the passengers were already seated, eyes forward, expressions neutral, not tired but attentive. And as the train moved without a single announcement, I checked my phone and saw the time frozen at 12:08. And the first stations we passed were wrong in subtle ways. Names half missing, platforms dim, stops skipped without explanation, until I finally asked a man across from me if the train usually skipped stops, and he answered without looking at me that it stopped when it was supposed to. And that should have frightened me more than it did, because by then I'd begun to realize there was no conductor, no visible control, only motion. And when the train finally slowed at a station labeled TER line, a woman stood up calmly and stepped off alone before the doors closed, and the train continued on. And as my own stop failed to appear and the tunnel outside the windows grew darker and more reflective, I understood that I hadn't boarded a delayed train at all. I'd boarded something that ran on a different schedule entirely, one that didn't care where I thought I was going, only that I'd been tired enough to step inside. Once I started paying attention to the other passengers, it became obvious that none of us were here by accident, because the people on the train weren't random commuters, but a collection of the same kind of tired, the kind that settles into your bones after long days and too many compromises. And no one spoke unless spoken to first, and even then their answers felt measured, delayed just enough to suggest they were listening to something else beneath the sound of the train. And I noticed that people only moved when the train slowed, standing just before certain stations as if they felt the stop approaching before any sign appeared, while others remained seated, even as unfamiliar platforms slid past the windows. And one woman across the aisle leaned toward me just long enough to whisper that guessing your stop was the worst thing you could do, because the train didn't like being rushed. And after she said that, I watched a man further down the car stand up too early, swaying slightly as if he'd misjudged the timing. And the moment he reached for the door, the lights dimmed, and the train lurched forward again, snapping him back into his seat with a force that felt deliberate rather than mechanical. And no one reacted. No gasps, no shouts, just a quiet acceptance that the correction had been made. And as more stations passed, some bright, some barely lit, some so close together they felt unfinished, I realized the train wasn't moving through the city so much as selecting where each of us belonged. Because when the doors finally opened again, 3 passengers stood without hesitation and stepped onto a platform with no visible exit, disappearing into the darkness without looking back. And as the doors closed and the train resumed its smooth motion, the remaining passengers shifted subtly, spacing themselves evenly again, like a pattern rebalancing itself. And in that moment, I understood the rule no one had explained aloud yet, that the last train after midnight didn't take you home, it carried you until it decided you were done riding. After a while, the concept of distance stopped meaning anything because the train no longer felt like it was traveling through the city so much as through layers of it, slipping past places that resembled stations only in the way a memory resembles the real thing. And the further we went, the less recognizable everything became. Signage losing letters, platforms narrowing or stretching unnaturally. Some stops lit too brightly, others barely illuminated at all, like they hadn't been finished yet. And I noticed that the passengers who remained were the ones who watched the windows instead of the signs, because the windows showed more than darkness if you looked long enough, faint reflections overlapping with shapes that didn't belong to the tunnel walls, outlines of streets bending at impossible angles, buildings stacked where there should have been open space, and occasionally a flash of something that looked like another train running alongside us for just a second before vanishing. And no one reacted to those moments except with quiet recognition, as if this was the part of the ride where paying attention mattered. And I began to understand that each station wasn't a destination, but a test, an invitation to recognize something familiar in the unfamiliar. Because whenever the train slowed, you could feel it in your chest before you heard it. A gentle pressure, like a question being asked without words. And those who answered too quickly stood too early. Those who hesitated too long missed their chance entirely. And I watched a young man grip the overhead rail with white knuckles as his reflection in the glass began to move slightly out of sync with him, his mirrored self standing up just before he did. And when the doors opened at a platform marked only with a flickering symbol instead of a name, he stayed seated, breathing shallow, eyes locked on the reflection, until the train moved again. And after that, his posture changed, shoulders easing like he'd passed something he hadn't been ready for yet. And it dawned on me that the route wasn't random, it was personal, that the train adjusted itself to each passenger's capacity, offering stops that felt almost right, almost familiar, close enough to tempt you into stepping off before you were ready. And the ones who vanished weren't taken by force, they were accepted by something they recognized too soon. Because when I finally saw my own reflection hesitate a fraction of a second before I did, blinking out of sync, I realized the train wasn't just watching where we got off, it was learning us, measuring how long we could sit with uncertainty. And as the tunnel lights thinned and the hum beneath the floor deepened into something rhythmic and deliberate, I understood that the longer you stayed on the last train after midnight, the harder it became to remember what home was supposed to look like, because the route didn't erase you all at once, it slowly replaced your sense of direction with a quieter, more dangerous certainty, that wherever the train eventually stopped for you would feel exactly like where you were meant to be. It was only after the train had been running long enough for time to feel unreliable that the rules began to surface. Not announced or written anywhere, but revealed through consequences subtle enough that you could miss them if you weren't watching closely. Because the first rule was about sleep, and it became obvious when an older man, a few seats ahead of me, finally let his head rest against the window, exhaustion winning out despite his efforts to stay alert. And at first, nothing happened. The train continued its steady rhythm, stations slipping by unfinished and unnamed, until the man's breathing deepened and his reflection stopped matching him entirely, remaining upright while his body slumped. And when the doors opened at the next platform, the reflection stood and stepped out alone, leaving the man behind, still seated, still breathing, but empty in a way that was impossible to explain. And when the doors closed again, the body remained for a few moments before quietly dissolving into the seat as if it had never been there at all. And no one reacted, not because they didn't care, but because reacting felt like another kind of mistake. And that was when I understood the second rule, that asking questions only shortened the ride. Because the few times someone tried to speak too loudly or demand answers, the train responded by skipping multiple stations at once, accelerating into darker tunnels where even reflections disappeared, and those passengers were never seen again. And then there was the third rule, the one no one said out loud but everyone obeyed instinctively. that you never guessed your stop, because guessing implied impatience, and impatience was treated like a flaw to be corrected. And I saw it happen when a woman near the rear whispered a station name under her breath just as the train slowed, and the moment the words left her mouth, the lights surged. The doors opened briefly onto a platform so bright it hurt to look at, and she stood automatically, almost relieved, stepping off before she realized she hadn't recognized the place at all. And once she was gone, the train rebalanced itself, seats shifting subtly, spacing corrected, and the remaining passengers settled back into stillness like pieces on a board after a move had been made. And through all of this, the most terrifying rule revealed itself gradually, not through disappearance, but through comfort. Because the longer you stayed awake, silent, and attentive, the more the train rewarded you with calm, with the removal of urgency, with the sense that nothing was expected of you beyond waiting correctly. And that calm was addictive, making the idea of standing up on your own terms feel disruptive and selfish. And I realized that the train didn't punish failure, it optimized it, removing passengers who couldn't adapt and smoothing the rest into something more patient, more compliant, until staying on felt safer than leaving. And by the time I noticed how few of us were left, how the car had grown quieter, not because people were silent, but because there were simply fewer breaths in it, I understood that the last train after midnight wasn't testing us to see who would escape. It was sorting us to see who could remain unfinished the longest without breaking. By the time the train finally slowed for what felt different from the other stops, there were so few of us left that the car felt oversized, seats echoing with absence, and I realized that this wasn't just another station along the route, but something closer to an ending, because the tunnel lights ahead didn't flicker or blur like the others. They steadied, stretching into a long, evenly lit corridor that gave me the unsettling impression of intentional design. And when the train came to a full stop, the hum beneath the floor didn't fade. It deepened, settling into a rhythm that felt less like machinery and more like breathing. And the platform outside the doors was wide and clean and completely empty, with no signs, no benches, no maps, just a smooth concrete surface extending farther than I could see. And for the first time since boarding, the doors stayed open without closing automatically, inviting without urgency. And the remaining passengers reacted not with fear, but with recognition, standing slowly, calmly, as if they'd known this moment was coming all along. And I understood then that this wasn't a place people were taken to. It was a place they arrived at once the train had stripped away enough of who they used to be. Because when they stepped off, they didn't disappear into darkness. They walked forward into the open space, spreading out evenly, stopping at precise distances from one another, as if forming part of a larger shape that only made sense from above. And the pressure I'd felt behind my eyes since the beginning intensified, urging me to join them, not forcefully, just persistently, like gravity quietly reasserting itself. And in that moment, I finally saw the truth reflected in the train's windows. Not my face, but overlapping images of past passengers standing in similar formations across countless platforms, layered over one another like exposures in a photograph. And I realized the terminal wasn't the end of the line at all. It was the point where the train offloaded what it had been collecting. People capable of waiting, of listening, of remaining incomplete, arranging them into something stable and enduring, something that needed to be held in place by human presence. And as the last of the passengers stepped off and the train remained behind me, doors still open, I felt the strongest pull yet to follow, because staying seated meant admitting that whatever the terminal was for, it didn't need everyone. And that realization terrified me more than any disappearance could, because it meant survival wasn't the reward for understanding the rules. It was just another variable the system adjusted around. And as I stood frozen at the threshold between the car and the platform, I understood that the final choice the last train after midnight offered wasn't between staying and leaving, but between becoming part of what waited silently in that open space, or remaining unfinished long enough for the train to decide where I belonged next. I don't know what finally made me step back instead of forward, whether it was fear or stubbornness or simply the fading memory of a life that still felt unfinished, but as the pull toward the platform intensified, I stayed where I was, gripping the edge of the seat as the pressure behind my eyes sharpened into something like pain, and for a moment, nothing happened. The train waiting in perfect stillness, doors open, hum steady, as if giving me time to reconsider. And then, without warning, the doors closed, not gently, but decisively, sealing the platform and the people standing on it away from me, and the train began to move again, faster than it ever had before, the tunnel lights streaking into lines as the car trembled beneath my feet, and I was alone now, the last passenger left behind by a system that had decided I wasn't ready to be placed. And as the speed increased, the reflections in the windows layered over one another until I could no longer tell which face was mine and which belonged to someone who had ridden before. And just when I thought the motion would tear the train apart, it slowed abruptly, stopping at a platform that looked painfully ordinary, fluorescent lights buzzing, familiar signage hanging slightly crooked, and when the doors opened, I stumbled out onto a station I recognized. My station, dawn light creeping down the stairwell as if the night had never stretched on endlessly, and the train pulled away behind me without a sound, leaving no trace on the departure board, no record in the schedule, and for weeks afterward, I tried to convince myself it had been exhaustion, a shared hallucination, anything that would let me sleep. Until I noticed the changes, small at first, like my phone clock drifting a minute ahead each night, or the way I arrived places before I remembered leaving. And sometimes, late at night, when I pass the station on my way home, I feel it again, that subtle pressure, that invitation to wait just a little longer. Because even though the city insists the last train runs only once each night, I know better now. I know that after midnight, there's always another one coming, quiet and unlisted, patient enough to let you walk away, but never finished with you, because the last train doesn't stop running when you escape it. It only learns how to bring you back when you're tired enough to stop resisting.